Welcome everyone to today's webinar where we are going to look into building sustainable businesses through life cycle assessment. As you can see, this is the part two of some of the series that we are going to take on LCA. So let me move over. Okay, so let's see. We have some housekeeping rules. I request everyone to be muted at this meeting. So we are recording this meeting, and it will be shared with all of you after this session. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a survey. We request you to fill out the survey form. And in case you have any questions, you can talk to us at the end of the session or write your queries at the end of the session. You can also write to us at compliance@apaengineering.com, and we'll make sure that we reach out to you in a couple of days. So today's speaker, I'm Ranjini Vardarajan. I'm presently the manager in compliance division at APA. So before we go into the topic, we are just going to see who APA is. So we have had over 23 years of experience across various offerings or various divisions that we have. Our offices is mainly situated in APAC, EU, and US. We are ISO 9001, 27001 certified, and we are also FISAC certified. Right now, we serve more than 350 customers, and our divisional offerings are in compliance engineering, sourcing and technology. We offer services as well as software and turnkey solutions. So we can see what actually sets APA apart is that we are customer centric. We have more than 22 years of domain experience with respect to compliance division itself, and we have overall put together 400 experts, and we have advanced tools for process automation, data management, and reporting. So here are some of the compliances we cover. So you can see we have conflict minerals, ECA, we also work on sustainability related regulations like ESG. Now we are into CBAM. Slowly we will diversify our sustainability regulations as well. Then we have Prop 65, PFAS, and supplier due diligence related regulations also. We also work on REACH compliance, and there are a lot of other compliances to cover, but for short of time, I'm just going to move over. Okay, so this is the agenda. Since this is a part two of a couple of series, we are going to do a 5 to 10 minute recap of what happened in the earlier session, followed by I'm just going to brief on what is carbon footprint and what are the components and global efforts to minimize the impact of carbon footprinting, and I will follow a very short and sweet example, and then we can follow that by the query session. Moving over. So I'm just going to recap what happened in the previous sessions. So we discussed on what was LCA. So LCA is in short, it's a tool to quantify sustainability, and LCA is typically a cradle to grave analysis, but we can expand that to a cradle to grave perspective because it will promote a circular economy. And then we also, in the last session, saw what are the purposes of LCA. So it's going to assist you in quantifying and evaluating environmental impacts. So LCA is going to benefit you in a decision-making process because it's going to give you alternatives to material selection, product design, process optimization alternatives also. Then it is also going to help you focus your improvements wherever you identify critical areas in your process, and then it's going to help you with communication and maintaining transparency with all your stakeholders, your regulators, and also the general public. Because LCS data-driven approach, it helps us measure and compare our environmental performance, and it is also very useful in providing policy development, and overall it is going to encourage a broader perspective on sustainability through life cycle thinking. Moving over. So these are the stages of LCA that we saw. So LCA is defined. LCA is a framework which is defined in 4 main stages. So the first thing is like you have to identify the goal and scope. The second is your life cycle inventory analysis, and then you go through your life cycle you go through a life cycle impact assessment. That is, whatever you identify in your inventory will be categorized into certain categories, and then you will understand the impact of all the inventories that is in the process, and then finally you will go through interpretation. So this is the LCA stages that we saw in the last session. And moving over. So these are some of the standards. It was mentioned in the previous webinar. So we have ISO standards that is being listed along with the GHG protocol. I'm not going into the details of this because we covered all this in the earlier sessions. I'm just moving forward. And we also saw, apart from LCA, what is product carbon footprint. It's a subset of LCA, and why it is really necessary in today's world, and how organizations are reporting on their product carbon footprint. So product carbon footprint is basically the total amount of greenhouse gases that is emitted during a specific product's life cycle. It is mostly expressed as carbon dioxide equivalent. So this is going to include all your emissions from all the product life cycle, which will be from your raw material extraction through the manufacturing, distribution, to the use of the product, and then the end of life, that is the disposal. And if it is going to go from, if you're going to, measure all the emissions, it can also account for recycling. And why is PCF important? It's because it is really required for understanding and managing your organization's product impact on its environment. And so this will give you a lot of opportunities on how to reduce your GHG emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions. I'm moving over. So this is how we report on carbon footprints. So these are the standards that's being used. So we have carbon footprint of products, and you also have a GHG protocol. The difference between both is like while your carbon footprint of products is going to give the full product life cycle. It will cover the full product life cycle. GHG protocol is going to cover the supply chain as well. So there's a difference. And I'm just going to move over. Not only this, this is a very short recap of what we saw previously in the part 1 of the series. And after this, we also saw some of the LCA databases that is being used, and some examples on how people are reporting on their product carbon footprint. We also saw, what else can we do to reduce your product carbon footprint in the last session. So right now we are going to move into briefing of the carbon footprint. What are the components of carbon footprinting, and what are we globally doing to reduce the footprint overall? So I'm moving over. So carbon footprint is basically a measure of the amount of greenhouse gases that is produced either by an organization. It could be a product, it could be an event, it could be an individual also. It is also expressed in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And here are some of the greenhouse gases that is covered under carbon footprint. It is not only carbon dioxide, so it also involves methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. So these are the main GHGs that is involved. So, and these are the components of carbon footprinting. You would understand why we have to necessarily see this components of carbon footprinting, because knowing what your components are will help you calculate your carbon footprint. So the components will cover your direct emissions, which are emissions directly that is owned by the source. Suppose you are a business organization, all the emissions from your particular organization or that particular facility, um, or the entity, like you have your fuel combustion in vehicles, your manufacturing process, if you have any on-site energy production, all these are part of scope 1. So whatever you burn in your facility will be a part of your scope 1. And the second component here is the indirect emissions. That is like you have emissions that you own or you control, but emissions you own or you, I think like I got this wrong. So indirect emissions are mostly which is being purchased, that is which is bought. So this will cover electricity and the purchasing of heat and so on. I will make sure that I change the indirect emission scope to here. And the third component of carbon footprint is your other indirect emissions, which is your scope 3. So emission which is resulting from your entity's activities, your facilities activities, but it is not directly, which you do not own directly or you do not control directly, will fall under scope 3. And scope 3 is classified into two main sections. That is, one is your upstream activities and your downstream activities. So any emissions that comes out from the production of purchased goods and services, or like a transportation and distribution, will belong to your upstream. So you're going to purchase, suppose you are purchasing raw materials from your supplier, and the emissions that come out of the transportation from the purchasing of that specific good from the supplier will all belong to your upstream activities. And you also have your downstream activities. So you have you have the final product and you are selling that out. So all the emissions that is related to that specific activity will lead to your downstream activities. So these two are covered as a part of your scope 3. So scope 3 is indirect emission, which you do not own, you do not have directly control over. So this is one component of your carbon footprint. I'm just moving over. Then you have your land use change, and forestry. Why is this important? Because emissions and removals of GHG also result when there's a change in the usage of land. When you're doing a deforestation, suppose you have to build a facility, you're wiping out an entire area of forestry. So there is a change in how the change in the emission of GHG there. And then there is also changes because of reforestation. Then we say this as an exchange of carbon dioxide between the terrestrial biosphere and the atmosphere is being altered when we use land, when there is a change to the land and there is a forestry activity involved. So this will also become a component of your carbon footprint. And finally, you also have your carbon offsets. So the carbon offsets are nothing but your carbon credits, which you use to, which you purchase in order to compensate the emissions that an organization or individual is letting out into the atmosphere. So these are the five main components of carbon footprinting. So in order for us to even go to the next, the final session of how to calculate an organization's carbon footprint, it is very necessary to understand what components are actually involved. And so defining your scope 1, where you're really, you have your facility, you're burning, and your all those you burn inside your own facility, or else whatever your entity controls, your organization controls, or else the individual controls will become a part of scope 1. Scope 2 is nothing but whatever you purchase, that is you buy from outside, like electricity or heating, that will become your indirect emissions. And you also have your scope 3, your other indirect emissions, which where your organization does not, or else the individual does not have a direct control over that entity, but you will have to consider all those items will be considered as a part of scope 3. So scope 3 has two different components. One is your upstream activity and a downstream activity. And finally, wherever there is a last but one, you have your land usage, change of land usage, and forestry, which will also contribute to the changing of the emissions of greenhouse gases. And finally, you have your carbon offsets, which are really the credits that you purchase. Mostly, if your organization is unable to lower their emissions, what you can do is you can purchase carbon offset by planting a forest outside of your area. So that's how you offset your carbon emissions. So those credits can also be purchased. So all these components are really important when it comes to an entity or an organization, to help them calculate their specific carbon footprint. I'm moving over to the next slide. We all understand, like I didn't go into the impacts, because we all understand what are the impacts of the carbon footprint. And so let us see some of the global efforts to minimize carbon footprint here. And we can see that the global efforts to minimize carbon footprints involves various strategies and actions across sectors. It is not only dependent on just one individual. So all of us have to come into agreement. So they are basically driven by international agreements. They are driven by national policies, corporate initiatives, and also individually we contribute to minimizing carbon footprint. So I'm just going into each and every item that we spoke of. So international agreements and initiative, all of us in the session are mostly aware of the Paris Agreement and Kyoto Protocol and Kigali Amendment. So all these were essentially provided to help reduce GHG emissions. While Paris and Kyoto Protocol are very similar in terms of reducing GHG emissions, Kigali is useful for HFCs, which is one of the element of GHG actually. And the Kigali Amendment says that they have to bring down the HFCs by 80 to 85% from their respective baselines by 2045. So these are some of the international agreements we have to minimize global carbon footprint. I'm moving over. So here are then we also have spoke on how national policies and regulations can help minimize carbon footprint. So one is carbon pricing. So in implementing carbon taxes or cap and trade systems to price carbon emissions is one way. We can see this implemented by EU. So EU had ETS in place, emission trading system in place, which is right now, of course, being replaced by CBAM at its definitive phase. So EU ETS will end, but the primary objective of this is to implement a carbon tax. So they are encouraging other nations from where they import goods to lower their carbon emissions. So we do this by carbon pricing. And then we also set renewable energy targets. So nationwide or countrywide, this will be, energy targets will be set by, And for example, you can say that, for example, India has set a target to reduce carbon intensity by less than 45% before this decade. And the third thing is, like, there are also energy efficiency standards, which can help improve energy efficiency in building and industrial processes. And then there are also subsidies and incentives. So each and every country can also provide incentives, for the adoption of cleaner or greener technologies. This is well implemented in countries like the USA, and you also have this in Germany, where US is going to provide federal tax credits for purchasing new EVs, for implementing solar panel installations, and Germany is also providing incentives for when people purchase electrical vehicles, or as they use renewable sources of energy. So these ways are like carbon pricing, setting of targets, energy efficiency standards, and subsidies and incentives are part of helping each and every nation lower their carbon emissions. So moving over to the next slide. So first we saw what are some of the international agreements, so what they do nationwide, and what each and every corporate offices can do. So in corporate initiatives, you can see that most of them implement corporate sustainability goals to reduce their carbon emissions. And then you also have carbon offsetting, which we spoke of, like carbon credits, which is mostly used for carbon offsetting, and investing in new projects that to remove or reduce your GHGs from atmosphere um, is usually used for offsetting corporate emissions. And then you also have supply chain management. Though we have just spoken 2 lines, I think out of all this point, the first point discussed, that is the corporate sustainability goals, will play a huge key. And then supply chain management is a crucial and also a difficult role when it comes to play to reduce your carbon footprint, because a facility or an individual can have a direct control over what they do. So controlling entities or facilities emissions is very easy compared to asking the suppliers to reduce their emissions, because we are tied to finding out what is our organizational carbon footprint is really tough, because you have to gather all the information from your suppliers. So supply chain management is going to become a huge key if you want to lower the overall emissions as an organization. So I'm moving over to the next slide. And these are some of the how technological innovations can help in minimizing carbon footprint. So we have renewable energy technologies which is in place, and we also have energy storage. Developing efficient storage systems like battery, that is one way. And then recently, carbon capture and storage is also becoming an increasing trend that we can say. So there are technologies where they capture the carbon dioxide emissions from the manufacturing or the industrial process, or the power plants, and they are storing them underground. Though this seems good for now, it also has some negative consequences because there could be leakage underground. But there are efforts continually that is evolving, uh, and newer technologies coming up to help us reduce our global carbon footprint. Moving over. So this is basically taken from the GHG protocol site. So we saw what were the components of our carbon footprint. So which is like your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, which is being defined in the diagram. And we've also given the upstream and the downstream activities. This is to help you understand visually what is happening. So I'm moving over. The final part is like calculating the carbon footprint. So, so I'm moving into how an organization can calculate its carbon footprint. So there are usually in an organization there are a lot of activities that take place, and they have to be assessed to find out what is the greenhouse gases being emitted from various activities. So there are these 5 steps that is given, which is usually done in place. So the first thing is like you're defining the scope. So where do you want to start? I mean the scope in the sense like identifying what your scope is, what your scope 1, your scope 2, your scope 3 is, what your upstream activities and downstream activities are, have to be defined first. And the second thing organization does is they start collecting the data. And once the data is collected, your data has to be converted into emissions, because you usually don't have only carbon dioxide that is being emitted. You may not emit, or a particular organization may not emit methane, but your suppliers could be down the lane who may be emitting methane, or else they may emit perfluorocarbons. So you have to convert all the data that you have into its related emissions. Then you have to calculate your overall emissions, and then you'll have to report and verify. So I'm keeping the example simple. Uh, so this is what we spoke from the previous slide. So defining the scope is like scope 1, 2, and 3. And then the collection of data. So data collection mostly involves on your energy usage. If it is going to be scope 1, it is easier for you to understand what fuel consumption has gone, how much energy or I mean like how much energy you're using. I mean like what waste, if it is going to be just the scope one, but collecting data defines all three scopes. So I'm just speaking in terms of scope one here, and base generation and like business travel is your scope three, and whatever relevant activities happen in your organization, your data has to be collected. So this is a very tedious process. Even though there can be systems in place or templates in place, collection of data initially when organization is starting to understand its carbon footprint can be quite tedious. And you can get the data from mostly utility bills, and you also have your fuel receipts, you have your travel logs, and then whatever waste you are disposing from your organization, or is you will have all those date bills available with you. So certain elements are easy to collect, but mostly, you get into issues when you have to collect your data from your scope 3. That is where most of the issue lies. And then the third place is like you have to convert your data into emissions. That is what we spoke of. And in order to convert your data into emissions, we use the activity data and activity data and your emission factor. Your emission factor is available in a lot of publicly available data sets. So emission factor would not be an issue. I have also provided the list of places from where an organization can gather the emissions data. Then once we have what are the activities that is happening in our organization, then also outside of our organization, because we are covering scope 3, we'd have to convert them into the emissions, and then total all the emissions from your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And that is why we say that identifying what activities happen in an organization and defining the scope becomes really critical in order to find out the organization's carbon footprint. So, and then the final thing is like you have to document whatever we use, and the methodology we use. So LCA is one of the methodologies which is used to find out the carbon footprint. That is why we are tying up LCA, and then we are coming back to carbon footprint here. But the session is not over. Part 2, it's just part 2. So as we progress into part 3 or part 4, we will go into difficult calculations and difficult scenarios. That is what we are planning on. And I am going to move over to the next slide. So this is the imaginary organization which I have taken, like Eco Invent Solutions. So this is a very simple template that we have shown. This is please understand, this is not the final LCA template. It is a template that you can use to calculate your organization's carbon footprint. And for example, I have written down the emission source, where the source is from, then what is the scope, and the consumption with units. The consumption is nothing but your activity, and what is the emission factor, and what is the emission in metric ton carbon dioxide per equivalent. And if there are any comments that I would want to speak on, I have written in the final section. So this is a simple template which you can start with, but this is not all of it, because what we are seeing is to calculate only your greenhouse gas emissions, which is just a teeny tiny bit of your what LCA has to cover. LCA is huge, it's vast, and we are seeing a small portion of how to do your organization's carbon footprint. So here we can see that I own company vehicles. I'm directly in control, and I'm using so much of I'm using fuel consumption for a specific year. So this is being done annually. You can do this exercise for your quarterly, for half yearly, how much ever you want, if you know the consumption value for quarterly, if you know the consumption value for half yearly. So right now I'm taking the scope of an entire year. So I'm saying like, okay, I'm using my company's fleet, so I'm using this much of fuel. So for example, let us take I'm using like 10,000 gallons of fuel, and the emission factor for that specific fuel, that is, I'm assuming this as a diesel. So for diesel, 10.21 kg carbon dioxide per equivalent per gallon is your emission factor. So how you arrive at emissions is you have to multiply your activity data, that is your consumption, directly with your emission factor. This is pretty straightforward. There is nothing secretive about this. This is plain math, and then you would arrive at the value. Like so, I'm going to arrive at 100 into 100 kg carbon dioxide equivalent. But because I want to report in metric tons, I will convert the value into metric tons. So finally, I would arrive at 102.1 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So I have just showcased few examples from each and every scope, but you can list down all the activities within the scope of an organization, and then you can define its scope, and then you can collect the data and provide your emissions finally. And then, for example, let us say that we are using fuel for consumption because we are going to produce heat on site. So that is going to be a part of scope one. So let us say I'm using 50,000 cubic meters. So finally, I will have 110.2 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent because my factor is going to be 2.204 for the fuel that I'm using. And so my total emissions from scope one, I have listed it here. It's going to be 212.3 metric tons. I am moving over into the next slide. So these are just couple of activities, but whatever happens if your facility, if an organization is a facility where they are using any process to manufacture any goods, obviously all those emissions have to be listed. For example, I'm using I'm producing iron and steel. My facility is producing an iron and steel product. So I will have to understand what is the activity. So is there any waste that I'm using, or else a scrap that I'm using in order to as an input to feed inside my manufacturing process to produce your iron and steel. So that also have to be a part of your scope one. So any emissions where it is where your facility is directly involved, any emissions that come out, so all those activity has to be recorded here. And I may be using a furnace, oxygen furnace for manufacturing of some iron and steel goods. So all those emissions also would have to be factored in. Right now, I'm showing only a couple of examples, but I think everyone will get the idea of what we're trying to convey. So moving over to the next slide. And then this is your indirect emissions, that is your scope 2. The scope 2 mostly involves electricity, whatever you purchase for your organization, where you have like where you actually purchase from outside and you use within the context of your organization. So you can see we use electricity for all operational purposes. So here we have written, this jotted this down as scope 2. And then what is the consumption of that specific electricity? As I mentioned previously, this is going to be entire annual data. So let us say we are consuming so much of electricity, and the emission factor for electricity is provided. US has its own emission factor for electricity. You also have IEA from where you can pull this data from. So I have also listed the sources as I previously mentioned. And so your consumption into your emission factor will give you the total emissions and metric tons kilo carbon dioxide per equivalent. So for electricity, I have right now received like 500 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Then supposing, let me say I purchase steam for some heating purposes within the organization. So that will also fall under scope 2. So I'm going to see what the consumption factor is, consumption is with multiplied along with my emission factor. So that will give you the total emissions in metric tons carbon dioxide per equivalent. And please understand for items like purchase steam, this factor can vary based on the fuel that that person is using to produce the steam. So you are purchasing steam from one vendor. So based on whatever fuel the vendor has used in order to produce the heat, your emission factor would vary. But of course, we have our emission factor databases, so we need not worry too much about this at this juncture. So you can pull this out. You can probably ask your vendor, have a good understanding, and then use a related emission factor for this, because you have to know what fuel they are using to produce this heat. And then you total out the scope 2 emissions. So this is for scope 2. And then finally, you also have your scope 3. For scope 3, I have listed a couple of more examples as well. So it's going to be your travel by commute, your waste disposal. What is the waste that I'm generating annually is provided here. Then I also have inbound logistics. That is like I'm I'm using freight to bring raw materials from my supplier to my facility or to my organization. So whatever it is, so I'm going to use some logistics for that, so that will fall under scope 3. Then I'm also considering this factor. As I said previously, suppose I have my supplier who's supplying iron and steel or aluminum products to me, or whatever products that may be. So then he is going to produce steel, and he is giving me some volume. So I am procuring some volume from him. So for steel production, let us say that I'm procuring 500 metric tons of that product. So you also have the emission factor for that specific steel, which is also provided, like 1.9 metric tons. So each and every consumption with multiplied with the emission factor is going to give you the emissions, and we can total all these emissions together. So that will be your final scope 3 emissions, which is 1,120 metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent. So this is just, please understand, this is just an example. We did not want to start with a very severe case, and then a detailed or else organization which has a lot of scope 1 and a lot of scope 3, scope 2 right on this first session. But we are planning to do this in the next few upcoming sessions. That is what we've planned. And you can see that understanding your components of carbon footprinting is going to give you a major advantage, because you are likely to segregate all the activities by the scope correctly. So once this is done in your organization, and once you have identified what your entire scope is going to be, because sometimes your organization may want to go only from only for the context of that particular facility, which means you don't have to go on for scope 3. You may just neglect scope 3. Scope 3 may not be important to you at this juncture. But when we say carbon footprint, though it involves scope 3, even if you want to understand how much, what is your carbon footprint of that specific facility alone, I think you can stop with scope 1 and scope 2. So based on your boundary, the entire boundary of the organization, what you want to cover will actually define what scopes you're going to consider. And understanding your direct and indirect and other indirect emissions will help you identify the activities in their proper scopes, and then provide emission factors to finally arrive at these emissions. So the next is a final step. So this is how we are going to calculate your total carbon footprint. So we are going to add your scope 1 plus 2 plus 3, which is going to give me an overall value of 1,952.3 metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent. And this is how we calculate an organization's carbon footprint. In our previous session, we covered how we a simple example of how we calculate a product's carbon footprint, which will be slightly different than what we are doing right now. And we also plan to take lengthier sessions on the same of how to calculate product carbon footprint. And also later on, we will move into doing a final round of LCA. So this is how we calculate our organization's carbon footprint. So I'm moving over to the next slide. So I have listed down how to get the emission factors, and because of not all of us actually, emission factors must be provided by the suppliers, but that may not be the case every time. So emission factors is well documented across IPCC, EPA, your DEFRA, GHG protocol. Most of the emission factors that I use, even as a part of my organization, belongs to GHG protocol. I have taken most of the data from GHG protocol database, and you also have EcoInvent database and IEA. With that, I would like to conclude the session. If there are any questions, please ping me on the chat, and I will be able to respond to you immediately. Thank you so much. Any questions or any other information that you would like to know, you can just ping me, and I'll be there to answer your queries. Anyone who's interested in any other topics as a part of LCA can also ping me on chat. I'll be ready to respond. Is there any specific sectors that you would want to see? Any specific examples that you would want to see in the later sessions? Like when we post, like let us know and we can take that up as well. I'm just waiting for a couple of more minutes. Okay, I have received a couple of questions. Okay, the first question was like, what are the elements included in LCA? In LCA, carbon footprint is one aspect of the element that you're asking, and LCA is going to cover all the activity that happens right from your raw material position to the final product to its usage, uh, and it may go on till your end of life. And sometimes in order to achieve circular economy concept, we will also go on for reuse and recycling. So it is also basically done in a similar way to what example we saw right here. But the thing is, you have to include all the activities end to end. So that is what will be those are the elements in LCA, and LCA will also have scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 covered. So LCA, unlike carbon footprint of an organization, you're going to use the LCA to understand, where, your process is going to impact the environment a lot. So it is not just like defining numbers. LCA, based on the emissions that you have in each and every activity, you're going to identify a hotspot. So it is mostly used for interpreting. So LCA, finally, it comes out to interpretation of how we are dealing with those emissions. And for example, let me give a case of a manufacturing organization who's producing batteries. And so during life cycle assessment, you're going to consider where the raw materials for the battery comes, what is your transportation related emissions, how you are actually producing your battery, so the emissions from that, and then what are the emissions that you're going to calculate from distribution of that battery to server, the point of contact, and what is going to be the emissions from a person who's using the battery in the car, and you also have to account for emissions once the battery is disposed, and then are you going to reuse any elements of that battery. So it is going to cover all your scope 1, your scope 2, your scope 3, and it will also include we saw land usage and land change, right? And if you're going to just discard the battery, it is going to also affect your environment there. So that will also become a part of your identifying what happens in that LCA. And in this process, though the scoping is scoping 1, 2 and 3, LCA is used to identify where your hotspot is. Suppose your raw material, your consumption of the raw material from the supplier is getting some raw material for the battery, and you are trying to produce the battery. Consumption of the raw material and emissions from the raw material, if it is going to be really high, then you will so the interpretation will be your consumption of the raw material is your hotspot in LCA, and in LCA you will have to work out with your supplier to shift to another supplier, or else promote some greener technologies with them. So LCA is going to end up with the interpretation and not necessarily a calculated value as we saw on carbon footprinting. I hope I answered your question. And the another question was like, do we support product LCA? Do we have any application for it? I'm happy to answer that we are diversifying into LCA, and we do know how to calculate a product's life cycle. So product carbon footprinting, we are well aware of, but right now we don't have any immediate software that is available for that, because we are diversifying into LCA as we speak on. So probably in 2025, maybe we can look into options for providing a software for product LCA. Thank you. And the other one was like, the question was European Union Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD. Yes, we are very much aware of CSRD, but I don't understand. But I don't understand what you would want us to help you with. But we are aware of the CSRD Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and we are using items from that, and we are going to use most of the questions applicable from CSRD even in our applications, because we are into sustainability related regulations, and so we also have a product on that. So we are using standards based on CSRD that to help organizations answer those questions. So if you need any sustainability related regulatory practices, or is how to answer questions for CSRD, you can separately reach us out. Thank you. And if there are any questions, then I would if there are no other questions, I would like to close the session. But please understand, this is not the end of it. We also have upcoming sessions where we will go into product carbon footprinting, and I will also provide templates and also help you understand how to go about arriving at emissions. So there are going to be fewer sessions in the upcoming months. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you all.